situation is that after the war was won, after all the many soldiers killed during apparently the peacetime in Iraq, the thing is that the Bush administration is coming back to the UN in a very humble position, because almost begging for the UN to come in. How do you see this?
Well, one of the, again, from conservative sectors, they were being warned that their arrogance and brazen contempt for the world were going to get them into a lot of trouble. I mean, violence is a very good means of intimidation, but it doesn't intimidate everyone. You know, there are other powerful forces around, there's people around, and they react in their own ways. Amazingly, in fact, I'm extremely surprised, they have failed to carry out a successful military occupation in Iraq, which is remarkable. If you look at historical analogs, military occupations have been quite successful under far more difficult conditions. I mean, even the worst monsters, I mean, take, say, the Nazis. They conquered Europe. This is the most vicious regime in the world, but they had no trouble running it. I mean, Europe was run by collaborators. The political collaborators, the military, the police and the security forces were collaborators. I mean, the Nazis are in the background. If anything went wrong, they'd step in, but for the most part it was successful, and they were under attack. You know, after all, they were under attack mainly by the Russians, fighting a huge war with the Russians, but also being attacked by Britain and the United States. And the resistance in Europe was very courageous, but they would have crushed the resistance if it hadn't had outside support, and it had enormous outside support. Well, there's nothing like that in Iraq. I mean, they're moving into a country which was absolutely devastated by sanctions. Before the war. And it's interesting that in the United States, you virtually cannot talk about this. So if you read the press and the journals and so on, they say the country was in bad shape, but because of Saddam Hussein. Now, you know, anyone who's looked at the record, and there's a rich record, knows the country was in horrible shape because of the extremely cruel and brutal U.S. sanctions. I mean, they technically through the UN, but everyone knows the UN would never have implemented them, at least in this form, if it wasn't for U.S. pressure. So it had devastated the civilian society. It had actually strengthened the tyrant, made the population very dependent on him for survival. It's one of the reasons he wasn't overthrown, I think. So the country was devastated. It was almost totally disarmed. It was under heavy surveillance by the U.S. It was being regularly bombed for years by the U.S. and Britain. I mean, you know, the country was a complete wreck. Here the United States moves in, it ends the sanctions. It gets rid of a murderous tyrant who the U.S. had in fact supported, but didn't want him now. So it gets rid of a tyrant, ends the sanctions, no outside support for the resistance to speak of. How come they can't, I mean, it's just a perfect situation for a military occupation to come in, find collaborators, run the country, reconstruct it. Everybody should be pleased. But they failed, which is astonishing.
Is there any hypothesis about this monumental failure? Because
it's a monumental failure.
Because what you say, it is quite interesting, because the Nazis occupied all Europe and
no problem.
They ran the country.
No problem.
And
or take say the Russians in Eastern Europe.
Yes.
I mean, they weren't popular, yes. But who ran Poland? Who ran Czechoslovakia? I mean, the people in the country who, if they got out of control, the Russians might move in. But, or say the United States and Central America, you know, it's just sort of the same story. You get collaborators to do it for you. If they don't do it properly, maybe you move in. But the United States and Iraq has failed. Well, why?
Well, have you any hypothesis on that? Or?
I do actually. A few, I can't.
Maybe
A couple of weeks ago. Well, a
Incompetence?
few weeks ago, I happened to be speaking to someone I can't identify. He's a high official of a leading NGO, and who has been in Baghdad since the war, trying to reorganize health services, educational services. He has a lot of experience all over the world, and his organization has more experience than anyone. He told me he's never seen anything like it. His phrase was arrogance, ignorance, and incompetence. Three.
Arrogance,
ignorance, and incompetence. And that's the kind of critique they've been getting from inside. I mean, the U.S. military was bitterly critical of the civilians in the Pentagon, Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz, and the rest. The military said, you just don't understand what you're doing. These people are extremely arrogant. They know they have enormous power, in principle. They don't have, they feel they can run roughshod over everything. They don't care. So they'll just move in, everybody will do what they're told, and that's the end of it. The soldiers who are there are basically untrained. They don't know what they're there for. They don't know how to deal with the population. They have neither experience nor training with dealing with an occupied population. They're not purposely, but just by the way they behave, they're antagonizing people. When people are antagonized, they react, but that leads to more conflict. The civilian administrators didn't give a thought to how to run the country. In fact, just to illustrate, in early May, so this is after the war, when Paul Bremer, the new civilian administrator, came in, the New York Times published an organization chart. It's very illuminating. I mention it there. The organization chart of how to run Iraq. And it's like a corporate organization chart, boxes and lines and this sort of thing. Who controls who and who answers to who. I think it had 16 boxes. At the top is Paul Bremer answering to the Pentagon. And then there are various lines going down, and each box has in it a name in boldface and a description of the person, of the function. And it's generals and diplomats and all either American or British or mostly American generals and so on. And then at the very bottom of the chart, there's a little box which has no name and no function and no boldface, half the size of the others. It says Iraqi government advisors. Now, that's the picture of how you run the world. Well, maybe you can run an ant colony that way, but not human society. And their sense of arrogance and power and ignorance is so enormous that they make horrible mistakes. Incidentally, this is not new either. I mean, take, say, Henry Kissinger. I mean, his ignorance of world affairs was startling, and it led to horrible mistakes from his own point of view. But these people are, and there was plenty of arrogance there too, but nevertheless, this is extreme. It's not, I don't want to suggest it's unique, and in fact, it's important that it isn't unique. These are institutional facts that are deeply rooted and show up in many different ways. Latin Americans don't have to be told that, they're familiar with it. But in this case, it happens to be an extremely extreme example.